In his 1987 film, The Lost Boys, Joel Schumacher created a gang of younger, cooler vampires to fit into a different time period. But what exactly is the difference between these portrayals? What do they say about the societal values of the time? Through careful analysis of Stoker's life, literary theory regarding monsters, Stoker's Dracula, and Schumacher's The Lost Boys, I will argue that the vampire archetype has evolved over the years to reflect society's attitude towards homosexuality. While Stoker's novel suggests that homosexuality must be eradicated, Schumacher's film instead explores the idea of a cure. The idea of Dracula as a sexual narrative is far from new. Horror author Stephen King refers to the Count as a perverse sexual evil and argues that this aspect, quote, revitalized the vampire legend. However, while the sexual undertones of the novel may be obvious to modern audiences, Stoker himself was a withdrawn individual. Well over a century down the line, we have been provided with much more context for Stoker. David J. Schall, a cultural historian and critic, pieced together an extensive biography of Stoker, though he left behind no real accounting of his life. Schall argues that one of the most important pieces of Stoker lore is his intellectual love affair with Walt Whitman, the poet who, quote, electrified Stoker's generation, in part due to his work's less than subtle homoeroticism. Despite Whitman's controversy, Stoker professed himself a Walt Whitmanite and spoke passionately about the poet's work. In 1892, his admiration for Whitman overflowed into a letter laden with coded language. This particular letter remained unsent. Ever the athlete, he set the stage with a lengthy description of his physical appearance, where he describes himself as ugly but strong. Later on, however, he refers to himself as having a woman's eyes. While Stoker was outwardly heterosexual, we have already been told that he considers himself ugly. Therefore, his woman's eyes are not a compliment to his appearance. They represent the way in which he views the world. This admission has interesting implications for the rest of the letter. Schall refers to this as a strongly transgender perspective, but he goes on to contradict himself in saying that we cannot analyze Stoker's sexual or gender identity from a modern perspective. However, whether or not modern ideals can be imposed on Stoker is irrelevant. His letter to Whitman still reads strongly as an admission of his sexuality. He states that he is writing to Whitman because he was different from other men, aligning himself with women's outsider status. In a more overt flirtation, he mentions that he was not disappointed when he saw Whitman's photograph. The confessional nature of Stoker's letter is made most clear when he analyzes Whitman with near jealousy. You have shaken off the shackles and your wings are free. I have the shackles on my shoulders still, but I have no wings. Stoker could be alluding to Whitman's shameless descriptions of male-on-male sex in his poetry. While Whitman had the confidence to speak of his desires, Stoker remained silent. He states that he has told Whitman, quote, all he knows about himself, referencing, of course, the things he does not yet know and the things he may be repressing. Interestingly, this correspondence with Whitman was not Stoker's first friendly encounter with a gay man. He and Oscar Wilde were friends, and Stoker began writing Dracula only 1 month after Wilde was convicted of sodomy. As Richard S. Primuth of the Gay and Lesbian Review Worldwide put it, his friend of over 20 years was going to prison for homosexuality, and he began writing a novel about sexual repression and fear. This sequence of events certainly points to a connection between Stoker's repressed homosexuality and Dracula. In his treatise on the creation and role of monsters in cultural consciousness, professor and cultural theorist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen wrote that monsters are created by a bored or repressed hand suddenly freed to populate the margins. According to Cohen, monsters fill the role of an escape from society's hermetic path, and their monstrousness comes from refusing an easy compartmentalization. They demand a radical rethinking of boundary and normality, and that is what makes them so frightening. Cohen's idea that monsters are stand-ins for cultural taboos expanded to the idea of experimentation in his 6th thesis. Entitled Fear of the Monster is Really a Kind of Desire, he writes that through the monster, fantasies are allowed safe expression in a clearly delimited and permanently liminal space. This idea is corroborated by Christopher Kraft in his formative paper, Kiss Me with Those Red Lips, Gender and Inversion in Bram Stoker's Dracula. According to Kraft, the vampire exists as a representation of desire under the defensive mask of monstrosity. Primuth's theory of the vampire's homosexuality is potent, though far simpler. In a time of extreme repression and fear for gay people, using their vampire characters as a metaphor for their own hidden sexuality was an outlet for self-expression. He continues to write, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, that vampires are evil, scary monsters that children and nice people needed to avoid, just like homosexuals. Though the Count is obviously the primary example of homosexuality in Dracula, Jonathan's struggle is even more interesting. He describes Transylvania as the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool, establishing it as what Cohen calls dark regions of uncertain terror that are also realms of happy fantasy, horizons of liberation. The superstitious townfolk leave him not feeling nearly as easy in his mind as usual. In this exoticized, permanently liminal space, Jonathan senses that he is in a transitional zone, and it scares him. In his first meeting with the Count, he notes that the Count's courteous welcome had dissipated all his doubts and fears. Kraft writes that in Dracula, all desire is fixed within a heterosexual mask. The deviant Count has used his mask to lure Jonathan in. This quickly changes when the Count gets in physical proximity to Jonathan. When he evades his personal space, Jonathan cannot repress a shudder. He later discusses a vague feeling of uneasiness that he always has when the Count is near. This is because Dracula's touch reveals his true physical intentions with Jonathan. While he is scared by these intentions, that first night he cannot help thinking strange things which he dare not confess to his own soul. Perhaps these are desires, or perhaps they are fears. More likely, when reading the text as an allegory for homosexuality, it is both. He is now inhibiting the, quote, ambiguous primal space between fear and attraction that Cohen describes. However, these questions of anxiety and desire cannot be answered by the Count. The text is bound again by its heterosexual mask. The vampiric encounter that Jonathan has at Castle Dracula is fulfilled by 3 female vampires in a scene that King describes as, for turn-of-the-century England, pretty graphic. Though Jonathan fears for his life, he still admits that he feels longing and burning desire for the women. He waits for their touch in an agony of delightful anticipation. In analyzing the scene, King writes that a highly moralistic society can find a psychological escape valve in the concept of outside evil, reinforcing Cohen's argument that the linking of monstrosity with the forbidden makes the monster all the more appealing. Jonathan is clearly enjoying this encounter, so much so that he hesitates it upon writing it down, fearing that his fiancée Mina will be made jealous by his arousal. He has nothing to fear, though. Mina, in her own fevered encounter with the Count, notes that she did not want to hinder him from drinking her blood. Jonathan's encounter with the female vampire certainly does not escape the Count's notice. He bursts into the room in a jealous rage, with wrath and fury that rival the demons of the pit, possessively asserting that this man belongs to him. It is also worthy of note that Jonathan is so attuned to the Count that he recognizes his presence the second he arrives. This suggests an intense fascination on Jonathan's part, perhaps indicating Stoker's true intentions regarding their relationship. In a paper analyzing the sexual symbolism in Dracula, Christopher Bentley maintains that vampirism is a perversion of normal heterosexual activity. But Kraft notes that the true sexual threat in the novel is that Dracula will seduce, penetrate, and drain another male. While it is true that every brush with vampirism in the novel takes place between members of the opposite sex, the fear of a homosexual encounter, vampiric or otherwise, still pervades the text. However confusing his feelings may be, Jonathan returns to England determined to destroy the Count. Mina notes that her then husband has never been so resolute, never so strong, never so full of volcanic energy. In his own diary, Jonathan writes that he dares not stop to think of anything except killing the Count. If he does, he may think more of the strange things that plagued him in Transylvania. In the final battle, Mina notes that the manifest singleness of his purpose. Jonathan does not stop to consider anything except the complete destruction of the Count's deviance. Even so, Mina herself cannot help but have empathy for the villain. She states that one ought to pity anything so hunted as is the Count, and says that she shall be glad as long as she lives, that in his final moments he found peace, such as she never could have imagined for him. Is this a symptom of the horrible curse he subjects to his victims, or simply a more modern outlook on vampirism, and, therefore, homosexuality? In a modern story, her pity would have turned into a desire to save the Count from his own evil. The idea of converting a vampire into a human, echoing the concept of gay conversion therapy, is when the Schumacher, a gay man himself, grapples with in The Lost Boys. According to Cohen, monsters are an embodiment of a certain cultural moment. This is incredibly clear in Schumacher's film. When the eponymous Lost Boys first appear, they are perfect caricatures of the 80s bad boy. Clad in leather and jewelry, they are emblematic of the punk subculture of the time. They embody, quote, a time, a feeling, and a place vastly different from Stoker's while fitting the same role. The Lost Boys are also proven to be fairly notorious in Santa Carla. They are called wild kids early on in the film, a sentiment echoed by many characters. Professor Frank Grady writes that in modern media, the status of the vampire has always been an open secret, tacitly acknowledged and tacitly ignored, echoing the status of homosexuals leading up to the don't ask, don't tell era. The setting of the film itself also strongly echoes Dracula. As mentioned, Stoker sets the scene in Transylvania as the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. The equivalent in The Lost Boys is an extended sequence of shots picturing the eccentric side of Santa Carla, set to the apt song People Are Strange by The Doors. Once again, this fits with Cohen's idea of dark regions of uncertain danger. However, Santa Carla does not become Michael's realm of happy fantasy until he notices Star, a beautiful woman who's part of the Lost Boys gang. Star and the Lost Boys bring Michael to their lair and trick him into drinking their gang leader David's blood. Though Michael's induction into Santa Carla's vampire underbelly may be through his attraction to a woman, Star later confesses that David tasked her with luring him in. Like Jonathan, he was fooled by a heterosexual mask. Michael is now caught in a liminal space between vampire and human, gay and straight. He won't be a full vampire until he makes his first kill, or symbolically has his first homosexual experience. David and the Lost Boys bring Michael to hunt a group of young men on the beach. The vampires descend onto the men in a frenzy of violence, and Michael is disgusted. However, his face shifts into a vampiric state in an unwilling physical reaction. He may be disgusted, but his body is aroused by the sight and a physical manifestation of Jonathan's imagined strange things. In David's words, Michael now knows what he is, though he is miserable about it. The crux of the film's attitude towards homosexuality lies in Michael's relationship with his brother Sam, who initially discovers his brother's struggle with vampirism when Michael nearly gives into the impulse to attack him. He is initially horrified that his own brother could be, quote, a goddamn vampire, even threatening to tell their mother. However, in a display of empathy mirroring Mina, he helps Michael, agreeing to keep his vampirism secret and trusting that Michael will be able to work this out. Unlike Jonathan, he does not believe that destroying Michael is the only option. He wants to help him so that his brother can be human again. Summing up the film's redemptive attitude towards homosexuality, Sam says that even though Michael is a vampire, he's still his brother. Sam is expressing the modern idea that homosexuals can be cured of their sexuality. One of the interviewees and researchers Creek and Dunn's paper on conversion therapy described a homosexual lifestyle as a gross, life-sucking thing, while being converted is a divine and transformative circumstance. The climax of the film follows this pattern. After the final conflict with the vampires and the Lost Boys, Michael's struggle with vampirism is over and the family joyously reunites. The Count's peace comes to him through death, while Michael is converted from his deviance. In the hands of two homosexual men, the enigmatic vampire has gone from a purely evil monster to one worthy of pity and rehabilitation. Count Dracula pays the ultimate price for his perversion, but Michael is redeemed and given a second chance at normal life, much like the queer people of their respective times. The role of monsters as stand-ins for people on the margins of society is constantly evolving. While the shift was an improvement, it has been a long time since 1987. As queer people become more societally accepted and vampires become more mainstream, we can look forward to a future where nobody has to come out of the closet or the coffin. Thank you for listening.